Dear jury members, dear spectators, welcome to my master thesis defense. In this video, I will outline the correlation between my master thesis and its effect on my personal performance of De Profundis by Frederic Rzewski for speaking pianist. To do so, I have chosen to focus on few points and ideas which, in my opinion, have the biggest impact on the performance. I will then illustrate musically why and how they impact my interpretation. I will finish this defense with the general implications of my research and how it has allowed me to position myself in relation to society. Anecdotally speaking, this video will showcase how the writing pianist influenced the speaking pianist. One of the main aims of my master thesis was the exploration of the political side of the Profundis, a piece in which Rzewski arranged the homonymous letter that Oscar Wilde wrote during his imprisonment in Reading Gaol. In my thesis, I outlined how the musical language of Rzewski, which he calls musical realism, tries to engage with the audience rather than alienate it. This idea of connection with the public was then directly linked to Marx's theories, more precisely his idea of alienation. But at the same time, this relationship, which is at the center of the Profundis, holds an important idea that really influenced my playing. It pushes the pianist to pay close attention to the meaning of the text to be able to deliver the full poetical strength of the piece. This naturally goes beyond just the words and the spoken part, and is a method that I apply to all the musical interludes as well. Following this idea, it becomes clear that the musical interludes are intricately connected to the thematics of the piece. In today's global socio-political context, during which our liberties are the object of serious control and regulations, suffocation can be a valid metaphor to describe what the cultural field is undergoing. A certain suffocation is also present at the beginning of the piece, however this time for different reasons. This is manifested by the repeated loud breathing in the first section. This loud breathing could just be a way to convey the sense of deprivation or asphyxiation of Wilde's liberty. This asphyxiation of his mind by the prison cell. The fact that the Profundis by Rzewski first starts with this image is also a way to represent that Wilde wrote the Profundis as he was deprived of his liberty, of the air of his soul. Similarly, I would like to draw your attention to the loud scream, which is the climax of the first musical interlude. I am convinced it is a symbol of something further, that it represents the unbearable of the voiceless. It gives to those who we do not hear a scream that resonates within each listener. Let me play the first musical interlude to demonstrate. In the previous passage, there is a clear sense of distress coming from the pianist. To showcase this distress is important, as my point as a performer is to mark the listeners, to provoke a certain discomfort, because this acts as a catalyzer for an active bond between myself and the one who listens. It makes the public understand that there is a certain madness to this piece, which will not leave the public unharmed. In another way, it also acts as a warning for what is to come. Now, whose distress is it in the beginning of this passage? That is an interesting question which can maybe be answered in the following section, where we explore the line between the actor and the pianist. For that, we have to reveal the imminent theatricality of the Profundis. Through this research, I have outlined how Rzewski's composition resulted from his connection with the world of theater. This allows us to observe the text, and by extension, the performance, from a theatrical point of view. To illustrate this, I will present the two following examples. In bar 63, for example, there is a clear change of register and articulation in the piano part, which leads to a different atmosphere overall. My interpretation would not be as convincing if this change isn't also followed in the voice with a different enactment. In this specific case, I have chosen to directly face the public and also speak more mysteriously in order to distinguish those two parts. But with the dynamic forces of life, it is different. People who desire self-realization never know where they are going. They can't know. To recognize that the soul of a man is unknowable is the ultimate achievement of wisdom. The final mystery is oneself. When one has weighed the sun in the balance and measured the steps of the moon and mapped out the 7 heavens, there still remains oneself. Who can calculate the orbit of his own soul? The second example happens in bar 339, where Rzewski specifically writes, hesitatingly, as if discovering these thoughts. Here, the way the pianist might recite the text is very specifically written by Rzewski, and in this case, he must do it in a hesitating way, as if he was discovering as speaking. To me, this is a clear didascalia, originally describing text or instruction not to be directly spoken by the character, and clearly shows the theatrical aspect of the Profundis. We who live in prison, and in whose lives there is no event but sorrow, have to measure time by throbs of pain, and the record of bitter moments. We have nothing else to think of. Suffering is the means by which we exist, because it is the only means by which we become conscious of existing. And the remembrance of suffering in the past is necessary to us as the evidence of our continued identity. This specific instruction, hesitatingly as if discovering these thoughts, suggests that this moment of the piece is an enactment of a character by the pianist, meaning a certain distinction exists between the pianist and this other character. But this line between the pianist and this someone else becomes very thin. To go further, there is also a question on who is the pianist enacting at a specific moment. In the musical interlude number 7, for example, who slaps who? Is it Rzewski that slaps the pianist, or is it the pianist that slaps himself? Could it maybe be that Wilde slaps himself, or that someone else is hitting him? No one can answer those questions with absolute certainty. It is, however, important to address them and realize how thin this line between the character and the pianist becomes. I would now like to continue by presenting another key idea present in the Profundis, which also happens to be important in the personal life of Rzewski: prison. As I have outlined in my thesis, Rzewski wrote several pieces that revolve around the theme of prison. From his musical experimentations with Prisoner in the 60s to his piece Coming Together Attica, they seem to have had a big influence on him and on his musical language. He found ways to musically represent jails. In Coming Together Attica, for example, the ostinato bass, which revolves around a G minor pentatonic scale in all kinds of variation, creates a repetitive pattern that gives the listener a sense of inescapable monotony, a feeling very similar to the one present among inmates. Such an attempt to recreate prison musically is also very present in the Profundis. Let me start with the most obvious example. When Rzewski writes to close the lid of the piano, he ultimately forbids me, the pianist, to express himself in the most natural way by the use of a keyboard. This deprivation of liberty ultimately ends in a burst of madness in the following section, and could be closely parallel to the beginning of the piece. There is deprivation which is followed by a burst. Another example would be the monotonous nature of the musical interlude number 5. The whole section has to be played triple piano with repetitive, monotonous, and abstract short melodies. This part also musically translates directly the words of Wilde and could represent, quote-unquote, those varying modes of anguish that Wilde describes in the previous passage. At the beginning of my thesis defense, I said how the act of relationship with the public is a crucial part of the political message. However, in my thesis, I also explain how important the thematics of a piece are in order to create a strong message. These unpleasant themes, such as inequality, injustice, death, or violence, all link to the idea of the sublime, which was further developed in the egalitarian sublime in my thesis. For Rzewski, myself, and many others, prisons are the symbol of oppression and of injustice. It seems that in the Profundis, one of the central messages of the piece is to communicate to the public the injustice lived by Wilde during his imprisonment in Reading. Passages such as where Wilde describes his lowest moment leave marks on the public and ultimately contribute to creating a strong bond between Wilde's suffering and the audience. Outside, the day may be blue and gold, but the light that creeps down through the thick glass of the small iron-barred window is gray. It is always twilight in one's cell, as it is always twilight in one's heart. And in the sphere of thought, no less than in the sphere of time, motion is no more. Playing a piece which shows the omnipresence of injustice can result in creating a certain sense of justice here and now, during the performance. Jacques Rancière, a French philosopher, would say that these micro-interventions in time and space are not revolutionary actions, but lead to the reconfiguration of inequality into equality during the performance through a process that he calls the distribution of the sensible. The presence of the public is paramount as they become witnesses of this momentary recalibration of inequality and themselves help this recalibration. I would now like to explain how the discovery of the language of Rzewski helped me make conscious choices for the performance of the Profundis. In my thesis, I outline how Rzewski uses different elements together, such as quotations, the use of traditional forms, or the reference to the musical literature of the past century, creating his own style marked greatly by a dialectical synthesis of all these elements. Let me start with Shostakovich. Shostakovich plays an important role and is a great influence in Rzewski's music. This is understandable as Shostakovich is inscribed in the neoclassical approach and composes under the influence of a great amount of folk music. That is something that Rzewski values and fits very well in his musical ideal of synthesis. So the influence of Shostakovich is also very present in the Profundis. For example, in bar 164, we can find a transposition of the famous DSCH of Shostakovich, a theme that he uses in his symphonies and string quartets. I like this very much, as Shostakovich was known to use this theme as a cryptic way to sign his pieces, and here Rzewski is referring to Shostakovich in a cryptic way, which is very anecdotal. Furthermore, musical interlude number 4 is, in my opinion, a clear resemblance to Shostakovich preludes and fugues, for example, the fugue number 15. Another passage that is the product of a clear inspiration is the musical interlude number 6, which directly refers to Mendelssohn's Songs Without Words. This information bears an important performative consequence, as it not only tells us how to play it in relation to the work of Mendelssohn, but the fact that those songs without words were primarily composed for the feminine public gives us further clear indications, specifically in a piece that deals to some extent with the politics of sexuality. This feminine attribute that characterizes this musical interlude is further emphasized by the feminine sounds that have to be produced, and is further accentuated when the pianist is required to perform the sounds falsetto. Let me illustrate. Up until now, I have demonstrated how my thesis has influenced my personal interpretation and performance of the Profundis. This work helped me create an important link between my research and the understanding of the piece, consequently influencing my performance. But if there is anything that my research helped me realize outside of the academic context, is to answer the question, why in the first place would I want to play such a piece? Especially during times when artists and the entire art field is deemed as non-essential, it can be very, very challenging to still believe in the importance of what we do. But are we truly non-essential? For adults and children to sing in a hidden choir in a concentration camp may have seemed irrelevant and non-essential, but they still did it. For starving musicians, it might have been non-essential and irrelevant to play Shostakovich's 7th Symphony during the Nazi invasion of Leningrad, but they still did it. For prisoners and inmates, it appears relevant and non-essential to hear a concert of classical music, but their testimonies speak otherwise. Ultimately, my thesis helped me realize that art is all but non-essential. We perform art, we listen to it, we create it, we watch it, because it is about our freedom, our joys, our liberties, but also about our injustices, our tragedies, and our death. It is about us, all of us, and no one else. And we, humans, together with all other life forms playing our part in the symphony of existence, can never be non-essential. Thank you.